Hello, everyone. Avi here again for part two of our Geopolitics series. So, I want to talk about as follows. Continuing up on our last discussion, I mentioned that the two driving forces are geography and demography. And that's what causes political leaders to make the decisions that they do. So, I want to expand on this a little bit further. And we'll start with the demography part this time. So a couple, statistics. We've gone more than 5x in our population in the last 100 years. Gone from about a billion and change to, pushing now 8 billion people. And this has a lot of implications across, just about every field. As at the end of the day, humans touch on just about everything, or at least that's what we calculate are those effects. And that could range from food to energy to 1,001 different things. And as we add more and more people to the world, obviously, you add more consumers, you have to have more supplies for them. So another thing that I want to bring into this equation is also the fact that while our human population workforce, if you would, went up by roughly 5x, our labor force or our capacity to work went up more than 100-fold. And the reason for that is as follows. We discovered energy at the beginning, or, at the turn of the 20th century, we really began to harness it. And for example, a barrel of oil is equivalent to 5 years of human work. And so while it would take me perhaps a better part of a year to go and till my field, I can now jump on top of a tractor, fill it with a barrel of oil, and get that done in 20 minutes time. This has led to a massive explosion in our technological capacities. As what ends up happening is that when you have a surplus of food, you have a surplus of people, and we have the ability to provide for them, we're able to fractionalize and become a lot more hyper-specialized. And this is something that we could see leading back thousands of years as, going as far back as the agricultural revolution. This is where it started. As people started, going from hunter-gatherers towards this more settled-like way of life, where we started to have surpluses, we had grain, we had leftover things for the year after, we were able to take people out of this role of being just a hunter-gatherer and start, becoming weavers and, creating clothes and scribes and writing down, culture and all these, 1,001 different job descriptions and specializations came out of this. The third part that I want to bring up as to what has changed over the last 100 years is that we've seen a compoundment in agricultural failures, and this sort of gets offset by the new innovations that we've created. And so I may get the name on this wrong, but I think it was the Hager-Bosch process. It was a German scientist in the late 1800s who discovered that by taking a petroleum derivative, we can actually break it down into artificial fertilizers. And then if we apply that, to fields, we could get, increased yields and outputs. And so when you take that process, which I would call a technological process, coupled with, incipient increase in demand from the human side, the human population boom, we've really begun to compound the effects of 10,000 years plus of humanity doing their small intergenerational changes to the landscape have really gone parabolic in the last 100 years or so. And I think one of the leading pieces that really ties this all together is our modern day economic system, and sort of the reason why we're seeing the problems that we're seeing today. And so if we sort of zoom out for a second and look at how economics got to where it is today, the current system starts roughly about 500 years ago. As we move through this period of Enlightenment and the Renaissance, and we realize that we can create this thing called debt, where we borrow against our future, bring that up in through the 18th, 19th centuries. Banks, are becoming these, massive movers of that, leading up into modern finance. Now, what economics today would tell us is that the first thing that anybody that takes Econ 101 will tell you is that the first thing that we do is that we assume that the economy is an independent entity. And so what that means is that before we get into equations like supply and demand and all these, 1,001 complicated different ways of viewing, just about everyday life, we assume that it's an independent entity. And the problem with that is kind of glaringly obvious. And the reality is that the economy is not an independent entity. We actually live on the world, on the globe, and we have to contend with ecology. And what I mean by that is that we could add $1 million more of productivity, but we can't necessarily add a new species of fish if we've hunted one out of extinction. And so the inputs, as a result of assuming this independent model, the inputs and outputs to our society are very skewed, and they're actually not the correct ones. And so what I mean by that is that the true inputs to society is energy. Without energy, nothing exists in the capacity that it does today. And so that doesn't mean that it couldn't exist. It means that we wouldn't be able to have sustained population trends at the rates that they are today without energy. Any country that takes away this process of energy effectively deindustrializes. And if you deindustrialize from the size that we're at today in just about every country, that means it would effectively make the Black Plague look like a joke. And this has massive effects on prioritization, on energy, on the economy, on geopolitical decisions that are made across the board by every country everywhere. And on the flip side of that, you have sort of the inputs being energy. You have this whole sort of mess in the middle called humanity, called daily life, whatever you want to call it. And the outputs to that is actually pollution. And so what I mean by that is if you think about, the galaxy that I'm filming this on right now, there's a glass screen in here, and there's some, bits of different, metals and alloys that are, welded together, and chips and all these, various different components. And to make each one of those, there's a large process of refinement. Now, that refinement, that waste product is not properly calculated into the equation. What I mean by that is we don't take into effect things like secondary effects from where this, these off, streams are going. And so if we think about plastic, right, the price that it costs to package it up and dump it out in the ocean, well, great, stuck out in the ocean, what do we care? To throw that in a landfill, great, what do we care? And the problem with that is that as we've compounded this problem on the one hand of massive population growth, and on the other hand, due to the capacity of our energy requirements, we now have a much higher amount that we're able to, our workers are way higher actually than the population. We've been able to create many more goods and services that were previously, not possible. And so our consumption rates have gone through the roof. And all of that sort of leads to these, when you look at when an economy, quote unquote, breaks or is inefficient, it comes in generally one of two ways. Number one being an energy crisis, and number two being a climate change crisis. And that's sort of, the dual impact that we're feeling right now. And this has massive implications on, geopolitics as a whole, because the two things that or really the one thing, but I guess we call it two, the two things that really scare politicians is food insecurity and climate insecurity, aka nature, right? Meaning we come with 1,000 theories about how to deal with, all these various forms of problems in society, but the one thing that a politician absolutely has no control over is the ability to actually produce the food or to create or affect change to nature. And so we're really seeing a massive crisis, if you would, because these politicians that generally feel all powerful are sort of reaching their finite, thresholds, even though they can constantly expand into that. It's a whole nother separate conversation. And so if we think about how it is that we got to this point, right, we should like zoom out a little bit and talk for, a second. It's kind of go off topic from geopolitics, but it certainly affects geopolitics in every, facet. The way that humans make decisions, right? So how does a human come to a decision, right? So we have our five senses, right? We see something out in the world, the brain processes it and does some assessment, right? So we have a sense, it follows it and creates a process that leads us to decision making. And the way that we actually make a decision is that we need context, right? If I say I want to make a fire, right? I smell smoke, I walk over to the fire, I see the fire, and I say, oh, this is cool. I want to make this where I am, right? If I don't have the proper context to that, right? Am I doing this outdoors and it's freezing and I'm doing this to survive? Am I lighting a fire in the middle of the mall because I just want to burn some clothes and protest? It doesn't matter what it is. We need context around that to tell us whether or not this decision that we've just made is good. Now, this sort of leads us to a weird spot, because what happens more often than not is that when an individual walks around in the world, what we encounter or are trained to encounter as a survival instinct is problems, right? Like I see something, ooh, flashing, sticking out at me. Oh, this is not good. What do I do? How do I change that? And so the problem with problem solving, if you would, is that we start from the problem and then we extrapolate back out. And so what I mean by that is, I see a broken piece of glass on the floor. And so the first thing that I think in my head is, ooh, sharp pieces on the floor, problem. How do I fix that problem? Right? So it's like, okay, maybe if I want to walk around barefoot, that wouldn't be good. I need to sweep that up. So I sweep that up and I throw that out to the side. Now, to give you an example, the reason why the problem doesn't just end there with this solution is because we have another variable called complexity, right? So we live in a world that's hyper complex. And as a result of that complexity, when it comes to making any sort of decision, we have things that are called unintended side effects. And this is true regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on, regardless of what sort of ism you use. And if that's capitalism or socialism or communism or 1,001 different ways of slicing the pie and viewing the pie, so to speak. We all have to deal with this same problem because we are all humans using this problem-solving process that is radically affecting the way that we actually make decisions. And so what I mean by that, and perhaps offer just a very short alternative so you sort of see where I'm going with this, using what we would call a holistic mindset. Whereas in this analogy of a broken piece of a window pane on the floor, instead of thinking about the shards of glass, I would think about the overall window pane. And how did that get there? And how can I move this in a way that's going to have what are the effects that moving a window pane would have on society? And when we start to do this, and this is something that's been around for quite some time, actually. It was the agriculturalists, I believe back in the 70s, and a guy by Alan Savoy or something like that, I believe is his name. Pretty sure he's the one that came up with this. And what they realized was why they started asking themselves this question: why was everything that could have gone wrong going wrong in agriculture going wrong? And that goes from their soils being degraded, having water instability, nutrient imbalances, 1,001 different variables, and it was sort of all coming down onto agriculture. And the reason for that is, agriculture only makes up several percentage points of GDP, but if you could think about it almost as like, an inverse pyramid, everything else in the economy relies on agriculture. If you don't have food, there's no lawyers. There's no, all the rationales that we're making, all the silicon chips, all the artificial intelligence, none of that matters without food for the humans to actually eat. And what has happened over the last, 10 millennia has been that we've gone through this gradual degradation. In fact, so gradual that we don't ever feel the change. And it's generally this really multi-intergenerational process of change. And that honestly moves at a parabolic rate. And so right now, in the last 100 years or so, we've really seen, the hockey stick effect where we hit that inflection point and now we're just shooting up, feeling really the most harmful effects of this. And one way to think about this is that we've effectively desertified or turned into desert 2/3 of the world. Sorry about that. My camera died, as I said. I will not be doing any sort of editing on these videos. but I still strive to give you the best quality possible. So we were talking about desertification, and what happens there is, over the course of these years, over the last 10,000 years since the agricultural revolution, we've worked against nature. And so that means we put, crops into rows because it's easier to walk through and harvest. And, you could extrapolate out to where we are today with machines and how everything's built in these nice little squares. And, we'll cut down a forest and plant, a single crop, monocropping, because it's easier than having to pick out, different things from different places. And 1,001, we're going to get into this in a different series, into a lot more depth on this. But the point is that we've really abused nature, and we've done it in a very slow manner, so we haven't really felt this compounded effect up until now, the last several years. And so generally what humanity, coming back to this concept of problems and how we actually solve them, humanity has a very limited set of tools to deal with problems. And in fact, we only have 3. And that is the first one being fire. And fire actually created the rest of the tools. Our second tool that we have is technology. And if you really think about just about any course you take in college, or no matter where you go, or what piece of technical tool you'll touch on, at some point way back, it was fire that created that tool. And if it's a piece of metal that was smelted down, or 1,001 different ways. And the third tool that we have is this concept of resting land. In the Jewish culture, they call it Shemitah, where it means once every 7 years, farmers, according to Jewish law, have to effectively rest their land. And this is the only other tool that humanity's actually used. And if you think about what that is, sort of in outside of Israel, so to speak, what that active rest means is, active rest is really allowing for, by the human not touching on whatever this piece of property is, we're allowing the microbiology in the soil, this living soil, to actually regenerate and recreate and create these synergistic relationships that would have otherwise been, sort of harmed in the process of, let's say, tilling, where you rip it all up. And so the only other analogy that we have for this sort of active rest, in the sense of, I'll call active rest the allowance of microorganisms to have a certain beneficial effect for what the human wants, is the creation of wine and cheese. Ironically enough, where we specifically take microorganisms and we allow them to create this process for us that we would otherwise not be able to do. And so where am I going with all this? I guess I'm, and as you'll see through my videos, I will go off on tangents sometimes and kind of lose myself. So bear with me if I end up sort of changing topics on this. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that the reason, bringing this all back to geopolitics, right? Like, why do we make the decisions that we make today? And thinking about, okay, we've added a massive amount of humans to our demography, and we've also placed them because of 100 different trends that we'll talk about as well, in less than optimal categories, in the sense that most of the world is actually getting older through the overall, the average age in a population, as opposed to younger. And so when you're younger, you're more productive worker, you're also a larger consumer. And as you get older, you're more of a saver, you're more of a draw or drain on the larger society. And we're watching a massive rapid agement across all Western countries. And this has been, going on for a while already, but we've more or less gotten to a point where almost every single country is below not even the replacement rate, but the minimum, sustainable rate to keep their populations at the same size. The only one that's holding at the minimum threshold right now is the US, and that's because it's sort of its own special category when it comes to these things, and we'll discuss that as well a little bit later. I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that geopolitics is a highly, highly complex and yet highly simple equation. And it comes down to the people that are living within each one of these countries, within each one of these regions. And based on that, everything gets decided. And so if that's, energy, because energy is the sort of multiplier, almost like the PE ratio For those of you in finance, like your price to earnings ratio, these multiples that we would put onto the human population, so to speak, is energy, right? So if we've got 5x in the population, we've got 100x in our worker force, we've now created a PE ratio almost of 20. So to, you can make that rough extrapolation. And doing that directly impacts every single one of the decisions that a world leader or a country leader will make for the benefit or the detriment of their country. This leads many, many countries in many different regions to have vastly different opinions as to what they think is correct, what they think is incorrect, how it shapes their culture. And when you compound that over, millennia, it leads to a highly, highly complex society. And part of this, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is the problem where we sort of almost stop at the country's borders and assume that one country over, they're not dealing with vastly similar problems. And what I mean by that is, take, for example, a problem like climate change. Climate change doesn't affect a nation up until its borders. It affects regions. In fact, it impacts the entire globe, albeit in different ways. And this is something that we are going to and we must deal with as humanity, as a Homo sapien, if you will, and not as an American, a European, a Russian, 1,001 different, or I should say several hundred different nationalities. And I'm going to bring this up a little bit later because this is really its own separate thing, but there is a concept of networks and the power that networks have, where we're able to really amalgamate people from all across the globe for a shared common purpose or interest. And it is only through this that we're really going to be able to solve many of the critical failures and problems that our industrial age and our information age, or for sure the industrial age failed at, for sure the nation state failed at. And perhaps now in this new era of an information age and a network state, or a network group or effect, not to use the word state twice, is actually going to be a lot better at solving. So thank you for part 2, and we will continue on in part 3. Have a great day.